Hello and welcome to Cambridge 02139. Tonight we have the pleasure to be with Geoff West. Geoff West, he is the past president and a distinguished professor of the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico. And Geoff is an expert in laws, but when people think about the law, you know, they think about like law and order, they think about like cops, and they think about courthouses, but you know, in science we tend to think in laws a little bit different, and people think of laws in physics, but not in biology. And I know that you have been working in laws in biology, so could you explain me a little bit, you know, how can we think about laws in biology? And
well, first, as you say, you know, I do come out of physics, and physics is a subject that really is the quintessence of being able to enunciate, define laws that have a universal characteristic, like Newton's laws of motion, Newton's laws of gravitation, relativity, quantum mechanics, and so on, which can all be put into a mathematical and quantitative predictive framework. And indeed, if you try to extend that idea naively to biology, one immediately thinks that, you know, this is certainly a major challenge and probably impossible, because life is almost certainly the most diverse and complex phenomenon in the universe. I mean, it's, you know, the physics and chemistry that goes on inside our bodies is, you know, extraordinary. And in addition to that, the very nature of life, one law in biology that we do believe in and we do subscribe to, of course, is that of natural selection. And so that is a law. There are certain aspects of it that can be made quantitative, but in general, the very nature of natural selection gives rise to the idea that every organism, you know, from the tiniest microbe to the largest mammal, the blue whale, to every ecosystem, has evolved under competition in a natural selection environment, the survival of the fittest idea, etc. And so you would expect that how it now appears is very historically contingent. It depends on its history, what environmental niche it managed to evolve in, and so on. And therefore, what has evolved in biology, I think traditionally, and I think unfortunately, is somehow a culture that sees everything as unique. I think it's very easy to get overwhelmed by the diversity of the multiple forms of life and the various manifestations that it takes. So, I, maybe in my great naivete, maybe 10, 12 years ago, started to get interested in questions in biology in terms of laws, only because I came across, in terms of my own readings and so on, some remarkable, what I call phenomenological laws, that is data that have been plotted in such a way that indicated a tremendous regularity in something that was incredibly diverse. And what that was to do with the way metabolic rate, which is the amount of energy that an organism needs to sustain itself per second, that's metabolic rate, how that changes with the size of the organism. So for us, you know, that number is about 2,000 food calories a day, which is equivalent to about 90 watts, like a light bulb. And the question is, how, for example, if you just look at mammals, what is that number for a mouse? What is that number for a dog? What is that number for an elephant, and so on? And what was discovered a long time ago, 70, 80 years ago, by a man named Max Kleiber, was that there was this extraordinary regularity with metabolic rate. Namely, if you plotted it versus the mass of the organism, that it satisfied a very simple scaling law. That scaling law is that the metabolic rate scales as mass to the 3/4 power. So And that's kind of amazing because here's maybe one of the most complex phenomena in the universe, and yet, looking at the way it scales in an extraordinarily simple way. And again, especially given the fact that every organism evolved in a unique way. So that of itself was surprising. I happened to be reading about it. I knew about it for quite a long time. But then it turns out that this kind of law for metabolic rate is not only true across all taxonomic groups, that is, not just mammals, but also insects and fish and birds and even plants, trees, and so on. In fact, across any taxonomic group that people have made measurements. But even more amazing was that if you look at any physiological characteristic or trait of an organism, anything from, the length of its aorta, the tube that comes out of your heart, to the number of heartbeats, to the rate at which oxygen diffuses across cells, to the genome length of bacteria, you name it. Anything you can think of, and you look at the way it scales, it manifests this extraordinary simplicity, namely this kind of power law, and maybe even more remarkable, the exponent of the power law, the analog to the 3/4 of metabolic rate, was typically a simple multiple of 1/4. So heart rate decreased as mass to the 1/4, lifespan increases as mass to the 1/4, et cetera, et cetera. So there were all these kinds of laws, and one of the systematic things that was manifested by them was that the bigger things are, systematically the pace of their life decreases with size, according to these quarter power laws. So the longer they live, the slower things diffuse, the slower the heartbeat, and so on. This happened in a very systematic way. So despite the extraordinary diversity and complexity, there are these very simple laws that can be put into a very simple mathematical framework, and therefore are ideal for someone coming from a mathematical or physics background to start thinking about where in the hell do these laws come from? Are they're presumably not diabolical accidents. I mean, they can't have, there must be 50 to 70 of such laws, all with the same characteristics. They can't be accidents. There must be underlying principles that under which constrained the way natural selection took place. So, and this was incidentally was recognized even if you go back to The Origin of the Species, to Darwin's book. There is a wonderful section where he talks about, not this particularly, but about the fact that, you shouldn't think of natural selection as just some totally random process. Physics, there are physical laws at work, and obviously natural selection has to obey them. And I'm afraid to say my impression is that mostly biologists have ignored that part.
And then Stu Kaufman and other people have been trying to revive that
exactly.
aspect.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then it would be right to say that just by knowing the mass that an organism or a species is going to have, you can determine a whole variety of things. You can determine how long it's going to live. You're going to determine, how many heartbeats it's going to have in its lifetime,
So if you know, once you know the design of the animal, that is, if you know it's a mammal, or a bird, or an insect, or a cell, whatever the organism is, once you know that, you tell me its size, you know pretty much everything about it. That is, in terms of its physiology, not only all these various traits, but also something I didn't mention, which is the underlying mechanism for these laws, namely the networks that sustain life, everything about those networks that transport energy and information, but also about its life history, as you said, its growth rate, how it grows, how long it takes to mature, and how long it's going to live. On the average. This is on the average.
On the average. So then, Why 3/4? Why not 2/3?
Yeah.
Why don't we live linearly proportional to our mass? Why 3/4?
Yes. Well, so I worked. I started working on this when I was still doing high energy physics, and then fortuitously, I was brought together with a very distinguished ecologist, actually named Jim Brown, and his then student Brian Enquist, who is now himself a distinguished ecologist. And we started, I'd sort of laid the groundwork for the theoretical part, but they'd been thinking about this actually from a very different angle, but because of, they were intrigued about ecosystems, and that there seemed to be these systematic behaviors in ecosystems reflecting these quarter powers.
Loss in macroecology.
Yes, exactly. In fact, Jim is the founder of the field called macroecology. So to cut a very long story short, the work that we collaborated on together was to formulate a theory for understanding the origin of these quarter power laws, and why, as you ask, it was 3/4. And that theory was based on a very simple, but I believe elegant idea, that the observation, first of all, that since these laws seem to transcend the evolved engineered design, I mean, obviously we're different than a tree, yet somehow we obey the same laws. It must be that the principles that are constraining this have a universal characteristic independent of design. And the obvious thing to focus on, we felt, was the multiple networks that sustain life. So in us, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the renal system, bones even, and so on. And the idea was that these laws are somehow a manifestation of the physical, geometric, topological properties of these networks. So ultimately, we formulated a bunch of very simple principles, such as, these networks have to be space-filling, they have to go everywhere and feed and sustain every cell, for example, in an organism. But it could also be networks within cells sustaining every local part of a cell. So there were these kinds of ideas, very generic ideas, that could be put into a mathematical framework. And when we did that, when we mathematized it, the equations could be solved. And indeed, all these scaling laws kind of tumbled out, and we could understand why there were these scaling laws, because that's already amazing. Yeah. But then where this quarter power came from, and roughly speaking, it turned out to be, despite how complicated some of the mathematics was, when you traced it back as to where the 4 comes from, this magic number 4 arose as a number that is really 3 plus 1, 3 being the dimensionality of space that we live in, and plus 1 is to do with the fractal nature of these networks, the fact that they have self-similar characteristics. And so if we had lived, if we were in, if we lived in 5 dimensions, the number would be a 6th.
And string theorists would be very happy too.
And they'd be very happy, yes, exactly. So in some weird way, you can actually think of this, in some weird way, life has exploited some of the optimizing properties of fractal structures for making efficient distribution to increase the effective dimensionality of the space we live in from 3 to 4. So that, you brought up string theory, so one could say, in some loose way maybe, that actually life lives in 5 dimensions.
Like
4 space, one of which is kind of fractal,
yeah.
And one is time, and then time. So we're actually 5-dimensional creatures.
Because of the intricacy of our internal networks.
Yes, and driven by, may I say, these principles which we, at least I imagine, are driven by natural selection. So one of them, for example, one of the most important, I mentioned space filling, but one of the most important is the idea that in some ways these networks are optimized, so that if you, as a simple example, if you think of our circulatory system, the circulatory system that we all have as mammals, we share with dogs and cats and whales and mice and rats and so on. That circulatory system is optimized in the following sense, that if I were to, just a trivial example, if I were to double the size of the fifth branch of my arterial system, my heart would have to do more work. But if I halved the size, it would also have to do more work. So we sit in some kind of basin, minimization basin, in this hugely dimensional space.
So we wouldn't have to like a smaller aortas or bigger aortas.
Yeah.
Either way we would.
Either way we would do more work. So that's the point. So we have, so the continuous feedback implicit in natural selection has in some way led incrementally to an approximately optimized system, and in terms of traditional ways of thinking, so that we can use more energy, more of our energy, for what is usually called fitness, our propensity to multiply.
And then when we escape the organism, when we go to like a forest, for instance,
Yes.
like a forest being like a collection of
Yes.
different organisms, and trees look very network-like to me.
Yes.
So
Yes.
do we find similar type of behaviors?
Yes, indeed. So one of the things that I think was powerful about the work was that even though a tree, a plant, has a very different engineered structure. I mean, it doesn't have a beating heart, and it doesn't have tubes. It's a bunch of fibers joined together like an electrical cable, and it's static as well, incidentally, of course. Nevertheless, it does have this, as you say, it has this branching network, it's a kind of fractal-like branching network, and if you apply the same principles to that network as we just described for the cardiovascular system, you find that it satisfies these quarter-power laws and so on. And incidentally, one of the things that one can get from this as a byproduct, both for the plants, trees, and for our circulatory or respiratory systems, are kind of perverse things like, if you wanted to know what is the radius, length, pulse rate, blood flow rate, the stress on the tube of the 9th branch of a hippopotamus's circulatory system, there's a formula for that, and you can put it in and you get the right answer. I mean, at least you get, I don't know if you get it for hippopotamuses, but I know you get it right for dogs, cats, mice, and human beings, for which there's data.
Yeah, so you have reverse engineered the blueprint of evolution.
Yeah, well, I don't know, I wouldn't know if I'd go that far, but it does, one certainly, I think it suggests indeed that evolution is not totally a random, it's not this kind of image of a random chaotic process. It is much more something that tries out many things, but in some ways is, and I know many biologists don't like this idea, I think, that there is a drive towards some kinds of energy optimization. And incidentally, you mentioned a tree in a forest. The forest itself is a network. That is, each tree is obviously a network, but a forest is a network, but it's a kind of virtual network because the trees are not joined together, but it's a network that is the network of the way resources are distributed, both above ground in terms of water and sunlight and so on, trying to get those resources, and also from its roots. I mean, the roots are just basically the reflection of the branches. And if you think of the forest as a network, so the individuals now are the trees in it, satisfying these rules, but the forest itself is satisfying these rules, then you can understand mathematically the structure of the forest. So
and those would be rules between like the size of the trunks of different trees.
Exactly.
And
how far apart they are, how much energy is flowing in this tree versus this tree, how many trees are there of a given size, and so on and so forth.
so basically there's also mathematical laws that forests describe.
Yes.
Forests self-organize into some
Into
state.
this, yes. So it's kind of amazing, I must say, just sort of tangentially, when I did that work, I don't know how to say this, it sounds a bit pretentious. It was I know this is weird, spiritually uplifting in the following sense, seriously, that you walk through a forest, you go for a hike in the forest, it looks like there's big trees, little trees, it's this random mess. But what is extraordinary, it isn't a random mess at all. It's extraordinarily structured. Just as, when you look at a tree itself, it's obviously structured, but the forest itself isn't just an arbitrary mess of big and small trees at different stages. It actually is highly structured in terms of its geometric distribution and in terms of the way energy and resources are flowing through it. So it's kind of a lovely feeling.
And I think it's beautiful because, in a way, if we go back in time, like Greeks were trying to fit everything into like a triangle or a square, into perfect geometric forms. And now you have found that in nature there are mathematical laws, but they're not so apparent as to fit one of these perfect geometric forms.
That's right.
Nevertheless, there is a more complex order that maybe we have been neglecting, and in our engineering approaches, instead of trying to fit everything to perfect lines, it might well, try to understand this order.
And indeed, fractals play an important role in this because many things have a fractal-like. I mean, they're not exact fractals, and in fact, even the mathematics, when you work it out, shows that they're not exact fractals, but they're very close to being exact fractals. And that does play a very important role, actually, in the fractal structure.
You have been working a lot in like these macro laws of biology or, or macroecology. But before you were working as a high energy physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the bomb and other things were created. So how did you get to Los Alamos? What was your career path a little bit?
Oh my God. Well, I was let's see, how far back do you want to go?
Let's start from like where were you born?
I was born in England. I was born in the west of England, Somerset, in a small village, small town. And
you grew up there?
And I grew up there. Then we moved to near London when I was older. And then I was a student. I was an undergraduate at Cambridge. And I was an undergraduate in physics. And the irony is that I did not enjoy physics at all. I didn't enjoy it at Cambridge anyway. And I decided that I wanted to be a writer. And when I was at Cambridge, I'd met some Americans from California.
Okay.
And this year is 1960, may I say. Okay. And I was so intrigued. They were like from another planet. They were so cool and so, relative to my stiff English upbringing. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to go for a year to California and, then I'll figure out what I want to do with my life, and then I'm going to write my great novel. That was my pretentious, romantic idea. And so I realized I come from a very poor background, and so the only way I could get there was if I found someone to support me. So I applied to graduate school in physics with the idea of going for a year and coming back. And I went to Stanford in graduate school.
It was not that bad if it was just to go and write a novel.
It was. So, but what was funny was that at the end of the first term, we had some comprehensive exam for all the graduate students in physics. And these graduate students were extraordinary. Several came from MIT here, Harvard and Princeton, and I was blown out. I thought, what am I doing here? Wait a minute, this is quite funny actually. We took this exam, and I was, I had no interest. I was all ready to drop out of physics, and I came top. I was first place in this, and my ego was so amazed at this, it changed my life. And I decided, my God, maybe maybe I do understand a little bit of physics. Maybe this is the route I should take. So I stayed in physics because purely out of ego, may I say, purely out of, not out of, and I must admit, not out of passion for physics.
But then you worked for many years.
But then I got into, but then as I went through my degree, got my doctorate, I got much more excited about physics. And just parenthetically, that's because of the other graduate students. The other graduate students were very good, and I got very excited about physics. But, and I decided to stay in America, stay at Stanford. And then I left there and I went to Cornell, and then I came to Harvard. And then I didn't particularly like Harvard, and I left and went to back to Stanford on the faculty. And then I got to Los Alamos because I was approached about forming a new group in high energy physics under a remarkable man who had gone there to run the whole of theoretical division, but he wanted a high energy physics group, a man named Peter Carruthers, who was a real visionary. And they offered me tremendous resources, and I was very young, and I thought, well, let's go for 2 or 3 years. Why not? That's what I did. And I stayed for 30 years.
Oh. And
we had a fantastic group, marvelous group. It was fantastic, actually. I mean, there were people like Mitchell Feigenbaum of Chaos, and eventually Paul Ginsparg, who formed the ePrint Archive, and all kinds of very good people. Brodsell Haslacher, cellular automata, all kinds of interesting things.
You were in high energy physics for many, many years.
Yes, so I was a standard doing, quarks and gluons.
And then you moved to complexity. You moved to complexity.
Yes.
And at Santa Fe, for instance, Murray Gell-Mann, who is Nobel Prize and father of the quark theory, he also, then now in his later years have been dedicated to complexity, among other things. So why do you think this change? What was kind of like?
Well, I don't know. I mean, he of course is a polymath. I mean, he's always been interested in everything. So I certainly, I mean, I'm interested in everything, but not on his scale. That's for sure, not even close. But what changed me, what got me, was that I was involved with the superconducting supercollider. This big
thing that we're doing.
And then it got canned. And one of the things that happened during that period was that there was a big anti-science, especially anti-physics thing in the 90s. And they would say things like, from the Department of Energy would say this, and politicians would say this, physics was the science of the 19th and 20th centuries, and biology is the science of the 21st century. Well, that's probably true. Even not knowing any biology was obviously going to be true. But there was a corollary to that, which was that therefore, basically, we shouldn't do any more physics, which was completely nuts. Now, I knew no biology, but I'd come out of high energy physics, which is a very arrogant field, and my arrogance got translated into the idea that if biology were to become a real science with a capital S, instead of a science with a little s, which is what it is, it needs to embrace some of the culture and paradigms of physics. It needs to become more quantitative, more principled, and more predictive. Some of it had, of course, but it needs much more of that.
So more theory in biology.
Yes, in biology. And so I knew about some of these scaling laws, and so that started me thinking about it, and ideas of the difference between physics, which is deals with simple problems, and biology, which deals with complex problems. And that started this whole train of thought of trying to understand it in terms of still simple physics ideas. And the problem I actually focused on to begin was, even though I knew these scaling laws, was the question of death and why things die and why things age. And in particular, where does 100 years come from for the lifespan of a human being? Why isn't it 5 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years? And where does that number come from in terms of molecular timescales. We believe, everything is driven by the genes and the respiratory complex and so on, which are molecules, and they have timescales which are microscopic. How in the hell do those add up to 100 years? And why is it that you're not going to live?
And if the molecules of the mouse are the same, then the molecules...
And they're the same, and yet the mouse only lives 3 or 4 years. So it's hard, it seemed to me a priori very hard to understand why it could be purely whatever it meant. I mean, if you read the literature at that time, it would say the reason, it's determined by the genes, as if that explains anything.
Yeah. But that was an assumption maybe more than a result?
Yes, and I think so, exactly. So, and in fact, I think most people now believe that. So anyway, that got me thinking about many of these kinds of problems, and then I started thinking about these scaling laws and so on.
And then in a way, even though we have a lot of like the same molecules than a mouse, like a mouse sort of burns faster.
Well, the point is that, yes, I mean, the theory of aging that has been developed along these lines is really a wear and tear theory. That is, that the very system that supports your metabolic system is dissipative. It has dissipative forces, it has friction in it, in simple terms. And so it wears out. I mean, it wears out both physically, like friction because of inelastic collisions of molecules, but it also wears out biochemically because of products of metabolism like oxygen radicals. And these can also be thought of in terms of friction. And so it's very much related to metabolism. So the system that keeps you alive is actually killing you at the same time. And you also, at the same time, put in energy for repair. So if you put all that together, it turns out, in a mathematical framework, you can understand, first of all, why lifespan scales the way it does, why it is that even though we're all made of the same stuff, little things aren't going to live very long because they actually burn up, they create more damage per second than a big thing. And even when you put in repair mechanisms, that result remains robust. And if you work it all out, it turns out you can understand where this, roughly speaking, this 100 years comes from. So you can actually do something. Then from that, you can do all kinds of interesting corollaries to do with potential biomedical applications, like, this whole question of caloric restriction. If you eat less, exactly, you live longer. And you can actually calculate that in this theory, because it's a theory. You can calculate if you eat, 20% less, how much longer you expected to live. And that agrees with experiments that are done on mice. The other thing, for example, is, metabolism is also governed by temperature. So, of course, for us, that's not a big effect because we have a constant temperature, but for almost all other life, temperature is absolutely a critical piece. In fact, just let me say parenthetically, that's of course the reason why global warming is so dangerous, because everything that grows on this planet is subject to temperature, and temperature, and it's subject to temper exponentially with temperature because of chemical reaction rates. So a 2 degrees change in ambient temperature has a huge effect on the rates of everything. And in particular, if you've got a lifespan, it has an effect on metabolic rate, and therefore it has an effect on how much damage it's producing. Therefore, you can calculate how lifespan depends upon temperature. And if you can then look at creatures at different temperatures and see how long they live, and it agrees very, very well with the data. Even agrees for us, because people have tried to do experiments on human beings to lower their temperature, kept people at lower temperatures. So it's quite interesting. So you can have all these kinds of interesting offshoots from this.
So it's beautiful. So now we all, I think, have a better idea that there's like an underlying geometry in nature that maybe is not so obvious, but once you look under the sheets or under the carpet, you find that there are these wonderful laws. And thanks, Jeff, for bringing that to us.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much
Pleasure.
for being here.